Okay.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm James Westbrook. I'm your new incoming chair of the Air and Waste Management West Coast section. Happy to have you here for our first event of the year. Happy to have Ben McCall with the US EPA to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act opportunities. We will be taking questions during the presentation. If you are listening, if you could go on mute until you have a question. I think there also is an option to raise your hand, so we will be taking questions during the presentation. And if you have any other issues or questions, you can put that panel. We'll be doing that as well. We are going to have other events coming up soon this year with Air and Waste Management. You should check out our website here shown, as well as also look at the chapter pages for chapter events. Our next event is a webinar on April 5th, which is a reschedule of how to master South Coast AQMD, the rule development process. I think that's going to be a great presentation. We'll learn a lot about how they're doing it and what's coming up in the rest of the year. Also stay tuned for more events coming up, especially our October annual conference that we're going to have location to be determined. Hopefully we'll be at the Southwest District again this year in person. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bernadette Shaheen, who's our moderator for today. She is the immediate past chair. Learning a lot from her, and I appreciate all of her hard work and also in getting this presentation together for us today. She will introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. I have the privilege of introducing Ben McCall. He's the Assistant Director of Air and Radiation Division of EPA Region 9. He oversees offices in the Partnerships, Technology, and Analysis branch, and he's been with the EPA for over 30 years, which in itself is quite an achievement. In prior years, Ben has served as the Senior Energy Advisor for the Guam Program Manager and spent many years in EPA's water programs working with U.S. and Mexican officials to develop water and wastewater infrastructure along our border region. Ben's a licensed PE with a master's degree in environmental engineering and a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from the University of California at Berkeley. We'd like to welcome Ben, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me here today. Inflation Reduction Act, I spend most of my days working on this, and I have to say it is very hard to keep up with all of the developments, even just putting slides together. You know, once slides are a couple of weeks old, they're already feeling a little outdated. So I'm hoping that from this you can at least get a snapshot of what's going on. If there are particular areas you know you're interested in, this will be a good opportunity to know which pots you're particularly wanting to follow as they develop. So maybe we can start with the next slide and go from here. What I'm going to do is just give a really overview of what IRA is, and then EPA's part of that, but then sort of go section by section of the different pots. So we were thinking, if you have questions along the way, put those in the chat or raise your hand, and I try to address them as we go. But also, there can be a time in the end for discussion where it's helpful. But just taking a step back on IRA, it really is, as you said in my bio, I've been at EPA for over 30 years. And we really do look at this as a once in a generation, once in a career opportunity to get at, really massive emission reductions, greenhouse gas emission reductions, but we're really looking at the co-benefits as well, and are expecting for greenhouse gases that we should be able to see reductions of 40% by 2030, partly due to the investments from this particular piece of legislation. And EPA will have or has available $41.5 billion, and we're not an agency that usually has programs in the billions range. Water programs maybe is the one exception, but in air, I can say we are not used to seeing dollar amounts this large. So this is really a new area for us. And if you can go to the next slide, you can see sort of a scale. yes, EPA, this is big with a 41 billion plus 11 billion in new revenue. But you can also see the top line is the tax credits through Treasury. I mean, there is a lot of money out there for new electric vehicle purchases, for manufacturing, energy efficiency, fuels. So one of the bigger drivers of emission reductions is really those tax credits. But EPA is very excited to be working on $41 billion of new grant funding as well. And if you can go to the next slide, from now I'm going to start getting closer in and honing in on those EPA programs. So again, 41.5 billion, 6 different programs account for the vast majority, 98% of the funding. And I will go into more detail on most of these. I'll go into quite a bit more detail, but I'll mention each of them coming up. But again, 98%, but there are 24 programs. And if you go to the next slide, even that 2% of funding left for other programs, they're still pretty big by EPA standards. 200 million for monitoring, that's big for us. And all of these other pots for they're divided here by EPA office. So I am in the office, I'm in an air division, so I'm much more knowledgeable about the different air funding pots, but we are certainly aware of the opportunities, and I will talk about the opportunities like with construction and understanding embedded carbon. That's a pretty $350 million in that area, also very significant, even though none of these on this list made the top 6 list. There are some things in here that I will talk about in more detail later, but there are also just, I think it's good to have the full list, so if there's something that looks intriguing to you, you may want to track that. So maybe let's go to the next slide and I will start digging in deeper from our programs. But I guess as we're developing those programs, I'll point out there are some guiding principles that we've tried to use throughout. And I mentioned earlier, looking at co-benefits, we are definitely focused on greenhouse gas emission reductions for this law, but also looking broadly at other air pollutants where we can, looking at non-attainment issues, prioritizing environmental justice as we establish these programs. And there's already been, and there will continue to be, many opportunities to get input from stakeholders as we craft these programs. This is really new territory for us. And we are often looking for input on just, and we have questions we're asking and then that we really are struggling with and want to get feedback. Struggling isn't the right word, but looking for feedback. But also there are times just for stakeholders to lend ideas for, what would make the strongest, most impactful program. So that's really been a large component of what we're doing as we stand up these new programs. If you could go to the next slide. Okay, so now I'm switching gears and we'll dig a little deeper into our programs. So the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, this is the $27 billion one, so the biggest of all of the funds. And in it, as we've crafted the program or are in the process of crafting it, we haven't actually released the notice of funding availability yet. But we have these 3 program objectives that we are trying to integrate into the programs that come from this. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions and other air pollutants, delivering the benefits of those greenhouse gas and air pollution reductions to low-income and disadvantaged communities wherever we can, and then to mobilize financing and private capital to get as much as we can out of our investment. If you can go to the next slide, you'll see there are 2 large funds or solicitations that are coming out. And we should see it this coming summer. The first one, the $7 billion fund, while called the Zero Emission Technologies Competition, it is it is looking to be very focused on solar, rooftop solar, community solar, and associated storage. This pot can go to states, can go to tribes and municipalities, and what in the act are eligible nonprofit entities. And I'll talk a little bit more about them in the next slide. But this one, we expect of the $7 billion, there will likely be 60 grants going out, and those can be used for financing for sub-grants to other entities to start deploying the zero emission technologies. But again, this one, like the next one, we're expecting the announcement, the funding announcement, to come out this coming summer. If you could go to the next slide, you will see the larger pot, the $20 billion. And now this one goes directly to these nonprofit financing entities for the most part, or financer of financiers, I would say, because they will likely be using their funding to partner with, green banks, community development financial institutions, credit unions, but to get at, so there won't be as many of these. There'll be 2 to 15 grants, we're thinking, across the country, made to help finance and leverage funding of others to accomplish the goals of getting these technologies out there. Again, this announcement is coming this summer, and I would look at it more as when these are awarded, there will be financing available through these funded institutions. And you can't really see, or at least I can't on mine, but on the bottom of this page, if you can get the slides, there is the link to the website that will provide more detail about this fund and when the availability, or when the funding announcement is made, where you can actually see, what we're looking for from grant recipients. Let me move on to the next one. As we go further, I'm going to get deeper into the Office of Air and Radiation, where I know the most, and that is where we are with this next program, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grants. And today was a big day for that program. We are announcing, we've put on our website and announced the grant guidance that will go out for the first step in this program, which is $250 million for planning grants, which again is a lot for us, but what is particularly intriguing here is it will set the stage for a $4.6 billion competitive announcement coming out the end of this year or early next year for those implementation grants. And those implementation grants need to tie back to projects described in the planning grant. So the planning grants are really the entry. Many of the entities that will be getting planning grants, many will already have climate plans, but this will help support that effort. But again, it is really going to be the mechanism that we use to have folks be eligible for projects in an implementation grant and have access to that $4.6 billion in funding. So for each of these steps, for each of the programs I talk about, I mean, the list of eligible entities is different. So I'll pause each time and note, who is eligible. And for the planning grants and for the implementation grants, it'll be states, the air agencies, municipalities, and I pause here and I added to this bullet that it's the Clean Air Act definitions that apply here. So when I say municipalities, that includes counties, it includes groups of local governments. It's broader than what a traditional definition of municipality is. And then tribes as well are eligible for this funding. So today, as I mentioned, we've provided our funding guidance and are now actively reaching out to each state. And you'll see the list of folks that are eligible and how we're dividing up this money, this $250 million. But I will note that $4.6 billion is a competition among all eligible entities. But this first $250 million we are allocating, well, here you can see how we are allocating up to $3 million for each state. And there's a pot for local governments, which again is, it can be counties, cities, air districts, all are eligible. And then our U.S. territories, there's a couple million, and then tribes, there's a $25 million set aside. So all of this, being announced today, the next step is really letting everyone know, and just making sure people have the information they need. For the local governments, you'll see the 67 million, and that is for grants of up to $1 million. So we're really going through the largest metropolitan statistical areas, and those top 67, the largest 67, we're just asking that local governments within those regions get together. You let us know if you're interested in a grant, and if so, who to work with. And we'll be doing that over the coming month or so. If you can go to the next slide, I think I hone in on deadlines a little, or timeframes a little bit more. Yes, and I even know this slide, as an example, things are changing quickly. So in this slide, you can see for states, at least, we are really asking by the end of this month to let us know if they intend to opt in and get that $3 million. This slide says we're asking the same municipalities and air pollution control districts, but the truth is, if you look at our guidance, we're giving another month at the end of April to let us know of your intent to participate. So there's a little bit more time, because we knew there would need to be more dialogue at the local level to kind of figure out, who might do what. But the point here, I guess, to make is, if states do not opt in, we will be looking to fund more municipal areas. And so everyone should be, in the ideal world, everyone will be covered, every part of the country would be covered by a state plan, but if a state doesn't opt in, we will try to, we'll be giving funding to more municipalities. I think you can go to the next, maybe I'll pause, well, I think the next one, if you can go to the next slide, if that's still this program, I believe. Yes, okay, so maybe I'll cover this and then I'll pause for questions. Because we're just announcing this today, we know there will be a lot of questions. So we do have webinars set up. There is one set up for tomorrow, another one on March 7th. And particularly for those that are hearing from us now that they are eligible for funding, they're certainly going to want to learn more about what that process needs to look like. And there will be, I believe, a tribal webinar coming up soon as well, though these webinars are open to everybody. There are different needs, there are different deadlines for different groups, so we're trying to tailor webinars to whatever the particular needs are. Maybe I'll pause right here, see if there's any questions so far. I know I've said a lot, and there's many more grant programs to talk about. But this is probably a good time to pause and see if there were questions.
So if you have questions, you can unmute yourself or you can type it in the chat box.
So Ben, Bernadette, so the upcoming CPRG webinars, what specifically is that going to be for?
I mean, we're at this stage now where those that are eligible for planning grants will just be hearing about it today. I mean, some have states knew it was coming, but now there'll be a better sense of, what we're planning to do to allocate those funds. And these webinars are really a chance just to understand more, what we're looking for in a plan, how that would relate to the $4.6 billion in implementation dollars that'll be freed up as a next phase of this program. So it's really to help potential grantees, one, encourage folks to be interested in this program, but then from there, what do they need to know to proceed through the grant process, and to be prepared for those implementation grants to come. And I should pause and say this is about the climate pollution reduction grants. These are really greenhouse gas mitigation focused. There are other programs I'm going to talk about later that cover a wider range of activities like monitoring, like adaptation. But this one really will be focused on climate pollution reduction, really reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and hopefully many co-benefits at the same time. Okay, well, I can move on, and I think there will be time in the end for other questions as well. Okay, so one slide covering 4 different programs, and they are big, but they're mostly here because things are still in development, but it is good to lay out what is coming. One of them is $1 billion for our clean heavy duty vehicles, and this is for not the largest, this is the class 6 and class 7 trucks, or vehicles, I should say, and we are expecting we've already had one request for information where we're trying to get stakeholder input as we design the program. And we will be doing that again by April. We plan to issue another request for information, I think with specific questions, but just again, to help us design the program that works as well as possible, but meets needs as well as possible as well. So that should be coming soon. At the same time, we will have $3 billion for zero emission port equipment. That will need to be defined, what would be eligible, you know, what exactly that program would look like. So it's too early to give much definition to that. I mean, the decisions haven't been made yet, but if it is an area that's interesting to you, there are links in here where you can get on listservs, where you can stay up to date as you know, plans develop a little more firmly. Another interesting mobile source development is there's $5 million to help states that want to adapt basically California's zero emission standards. We'll need to define how that process will happen. I know that's 5 million. It's not 3 billion. It's not as big as some of the other things on here, but it's pretty unique, but still not yet fully fleshed out. So but that's coming if folks are interested in that. And then 60 million for our Diesel Emission Reduction Act, our DERA funding, which we is a historical program. So this isn't really new funding, but it's another 60 million to help accomplish those goals, where we can fund replacement of older legacy diesel equipment and fund either newer diesel or alternatives. We funded, you know, many zero emission technologies, etc. And so that will be coming as well, another 60 million for DERA. Okay, maybe we can move on to the next slide. So we're getting, I'm not saying speculative here, but we're getting to places where things are still gelling. So I can tell you what's in the statute, but we're definitely not at the place yet where I have like a clear description of how these funds will be allocated. But I will say that another significant program in IRA, you know, was the $1.5 billion available to address methane emissions from petroleum and natural gas systems. So there's a couple of different pots within it. One targeting incentives for methane mitigation and monitoring, and another more focused on the marginal conventional wells. And again, details to come. But what else is unique in this section of IRA is that there's also a waste emissions charge that begins next year for emissions greater than 25,000 metric tons, and it ramps up with time. So yeah, I'll just say that's a pretty unique feature. The other programs I've talked about are all grant funds. This is the one that also has a fee attached to it as well. Okay, maybe let's move on to the next one. So here now, one slide to capture many different pots that are tied to monitoring. The first 4 on the top of this slide are under our typical sections 103 and 105 of the Clean Air Act, which is where we typically fund clean air agencies for monitoring or for program development. But under IRA, there are several things going on. The first one is really third on that list, the Clean Air Act grants, that 25 million, which is pretty general funding, and it's going to be available, or is is really now available for existing 105 Clean Air Act 105 grantees. So the air districts and states that we work with, we will parse out that 25 million to them, and it can be used to help prepare for the rest of the IRA funding. But it really is those sections, or the section 103 of the Clean Air Act, is pretty open to many different uses. So I think Congress was looking at a way to help cover many of the needs that our air districts are facing. But that, now going to the top, that first bullet, I mean, there's another 117 million coming for a wide range of things: fence line monitoring, screening monitoring, the air toxics, community monitoring. There will be portions of this will be competitive grants, as we had seen in the recent past with American Rescue Plan, ARP funding. There will be opportunities coming up with this pot as well, but they're not there yet. Same with the 50 million for the multi-pollutant monitoring stations. We're not at a place yet where we can fully describe that, but it is coming, and there are other sections of IRA that get at sensors and wood heater emissions and methane monitoring. But it's still kind of premature to talk about how those funds will be allocated. So separate from our sections 103 and 105, which again, the air districts will know what that means, and it'll spark something in their minds about how those funds might be used, but everyone else maybe not so much. But I will say, separate from that, we've got $50 million to address air pollution at schools, and that won't be under 103 or 105, and we are trying to figure out how to administer those funds in a way that would be helpful. So maybe I'll pause again and see if there are any questions or thoughts on these last few slides I went through. I know I covered a lot, from monitoring to mobile sources. So I can just pause real briefly and see if there's anything folks had questions on.
Hi, Ben. This is Subin from University of Houston. I had a quick question. So for the monitoring sites and the research, are those grants going to be going to, as you said earlier, the local governments, or is that open for research universities?
You're talking about the slide that you see right now, the community
Right
air
now,
pollution?
yeah.
Yeah, so the top ones, when it says sections 103 and 105, it is really those entities that are eligible for Clean Air Act 103 and 105 funding, which is it is the states and the air districts, the counties. It depends on how things are arranged in each state. They can work with others, but those are the entities that we are able to provide funding to directly.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts? I see in the chat, waste emission charge. How is waste emissions defined? This is out of my knowledge area a bit. I know that we are definitely tied to there are other sections of this piece of IRA that talk about the greenhouse gas reporting that now oil and gas and other sectors are doing routinely with EPA. So I believe it's connected with the reporting that already happens. But I also believe that this has to be defined a little bit better. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm capable of answering that question well. But I think more guidance will come as that program develops. Okay, well, maybe we can move on to the next slide. So here are a couple of resources that might be useful. One, the White House Guide covers EPA, but covers all the different agencies that have a piece of the Inflation Reduction Act. So a good resource. And then for EPA, we have one that kind of is our central point for all the different pots. But as I mentioned, you know, Office of Air and Radiation has many pots, and there'll be sub-sites on each of them. I'm about to talk about some of those from our Environmental Justice Office. You know, there are different sites for that, and our Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and yet another site. So this is a good, I guess, entry. But if you know there is a particular fund that is intriguing to you and you want to follow a little bit more, you might start with the site I have on this page, but you'll soon, there might be a more specific site that you would want to go to for that particular fund that you're wanting to track. Should have put this on the end because it doesn't segue well to the next topic, which is I believe the environmental justice projects on the next slide. So another big pot, $2.8 billion of funding for our block grants, which I'll talk quite a bit more about, but then $200 million for technical assistance. There is right now a request for information open through March 17th. And I will note for all of these, the target beneficiary or recipients are community-based organizations. And I recognize that there may not be community-based organizations on this call, but I think it's still really good to talk about with all of you, because when we get to the part of the slide that talks about what's eligible, there's a lot of very interesting things on here that are very much aligned with a lot of the work that you all are doing. But just know that a community-based organization needs to be a part of a project, but could be very much in line with goals that you all have as well. So it's definitely worth talking about this program. Okay, request for information open now through March 17th. And you can see on there the different questions they have, the different places they're trying to seek input as they craft this program. And are hoping, like, by this summer to be able to get this mega announcement out there. Now, if you go to the next slide, let's see. Well, eligible entities, not spelled right. I was afraid of that. So again, community-based organizations are the focus of these grants. That said, tribes and local governments, institutions of higher education, can be a part, it can be work on these projects, but it has to be in partnership with a community-based organization. So it's pretty unique setup, and this comes from the legislation itself. But just to note now, even though we haven't, you know, the guidance isn't out there yet on these grants, it's coming this summer. But if on my next slide, when I talk about what is eligible, is intriguing to you, it is not too early to start working with community-based organizations in your area or with similar interests as to what you're trying to accomplish. It is never too early to start thinking about those partnerships. And now, if you go to the next slide, you can see, you know, why I'm raising this. What are the things that are eligible? And I think there's a lot in here that gets at a lot of the work that we all do. It can cover monitoring. Low and zero emission and resilient technologies can mean a lot of things. It can be zero emission vehicles. It can be zero emission power generation. Resiliency is built into this. I mean, that alone is a very huge bullet. But it also can talk about mitigating climate and health risks from urban heat islands, wood stove emissions, wildfire events. A lot of us pay a lot of attention to these issues and have not had ability to get at $3 billion of funding, or $2 billion in this case for the block grants. So this is really a lot of money from EPA's perspective, a lot of money eligible to get at issues that we have not been able to address nearly at this magnitude. Indoor air, toxics, you name it. So again, if these are areas where you you have a need or an interest in project development, think about community-based organizations you may want to partner with or may want to partner with you. And it is not too early to think about this. This is really, I mean, as an example for indoor air, we have an indoor air program, and sometimes we have limited funding. We have never had anything close to this amount of money to address this really huge, important topic area. And so again, just want to point out, this is an important one, a unique one, but it does take some planning, especially if you're not a community-based organization. It takes some planning to figure out, how you might access and develop projects under this topic area. Maybe I'll pause. I'll pause here and to see if any of those things sparked a question. But there are some other EJ grants coming up in these next couple of slides. But if anyone has a question on this, I will pause for it. Okay, well, let me keep going in the environmental justice arena. There are a few open solicitations that I wanted to let folks know about. If you could go to the, yes, there we go. So two that are open until April 10th. The EJ Collaborative Problem Solving Grants, and these go to, again, these go to community-based organizations. And the second one is the government-to-government grants that can go to government agencies that are partnering or trying to partner with community-based organizations. It can include pilot programs. It's fairly broad, and I know many of you are in California, and there are lots of efforts going on to engage at the community level, do monitoring at the community level, and so there's an infrastructure, I would say, that these grants can build off of. But these grants are also out there to help initiate programs and help serve the needs of agencies, but also community organizations to be able to address localized needs. Okay, then the next slide covers one that opened more recently, and it's a grant maker grant, which I like that phrase. I haven't heard it before, but we are hoping to fund 11 grant makers across the country that will help organizations. We won't fund the smaller organizations directly, but we have substantial dollar amounts from IRA and some of our base appropriations for assessment work, for planning work, and then for project development. So again, we will be helping community-based organizations through these grant makers, but it's a fairly significant investment in all things assessment, planning, and project development. So it's open now through the end of May. And then we expect by late this summer to actually select those grant makers, which kicks them into gear to start giving out sub-grants to interested entities. Okay, next, I think we are out of the environmental justice section and onto our Office of Chemical Safety. And this really is the last slide, so we'll be open to be able to talk about other questions you may have after this one, but also very unique for $350 million for us in an era where I don't think we've had significant resources before, but really focused on, I highlighted construction materials, measuring the embedded carbon emissions, reporting, labeling. There is, I mean, it's a significant investment to be able to better articulate the amount of carbon in the products used for construction. And like our other programs, we are really trying to get stakeholder feedback on as we design our programs. And so there is the next slide that talks about a few webinars coming up. If you could move to that one, where we are basically, these are in public engagement webinars where we're really trying to have a conversation on these 3 different topic areas. One of them is tomorrow, same day as our climate pollution reduction webinar. I know we're overloading you all with materials. So I apologize. It's a lot of resources coming at the same time, and sometimes we're trying to space them out and don't always succeed. But you will see if this is an area of interest to you. One, we're in the information collection stage, request for information open until May 1st, and these webinars going on, but then kicking into gear to figuring out the investment plan to get the most use out of those funds. I do believe this is my last slide. Can we verify that that's true? Yeah, that does seem to be true. Okay, so maybe now, really a chance again for any questions on any of the topics we talked about, or any feedback you might want to provide.
Again, a reminder to unmute yourself when you ask the question, or you can put it in the chat box.
I mean, there's a lot of different material. There's a lot of very different grant programs. And honestly, they're all at different stages of development. So we are trying to pull together the best information as we design these things, but they're also very different. They all have different grantees. They all have different intended purposes, from monitoring to air toxics to embedded carbon in construction material. So very different needs to design those programs.
And just to let everyone know, this presentation will be on our website. If you go to the West Coast section website, under the announcement page, or the events page, if from the home screen, if you go to the events page, this event is there. It's probably in the past events, previous meetings, and you can click on the to read more. Okay, so on this page is where we'll put the presentation and the video from today also on this page. So if you go here, the presentation should be there in a couple of days. So if you go here next week, the video and the presentation will be on this page. And you're still open for questions. If anybody has questions, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for this wonderful presentation. I was curious how EPA determines like the allocation of funding to different programs.
So each of the dollar amounts I mentioned today are straight out of the law itself. It was pretty clear, one, how the dollar amounts for each agency or for each section of the act, but also who the eligible entities were. I mean, that came from Congress. Right now, from that, we're just figuring out how to define the programs and what's specifically to be eligible, and just the process that goes along with it.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And another question that's beyond the scope here, but I was curious if there's any additional funding for research programs.
Well, there may be, as part of the monitoring, there might be pots of that are geared towards aspects of research. So I would say stay tuned to that one to figure it out, to find out. I mean, it's still being defined. But But and the other one, I do note that the environmental and community justice block grants, it is open to institutions of higher education. I mean, that is, so I take that to mean that aspects of what might be a useful project may have research elements to it.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Don't see any other questions in the chat box. Can you elaborate on the diesel emission reduction, the 60 million? So
Sure.
Yeah.
We do that. We have an annual, we've had since 2008 is when the Diesel Emission Reduction Act first came out. So that's more of an annual funding program. And some years it's more than 60 million, other years it's been less than that. But IRA itself gave us, boosted it, gave us another 60 million to work with. But we have had annual grants going out for the diesel replacement, and it can cover but it's about diesel replacement. I mean, to either cleaner diesel engines or alternate cleaner, it could be zero emission technologies. Your agency, South Coast, has been the recipient of many DERA grants in the past. But it really is geared towards, helping get the legacy diesel fleets replaced with cleaner engines, cleaner or zero emission engines.
Right. Would it be available for stationary sources also, or if this is mostly for the mobile sources?
If it's a diesel powered piece of equipment, then yes, it could be eligible.
Okay. And for cleaner technology,
we have funded the replacement of older power generation to either newer diesel or to other technologies. So we definitely have funded stationary applications before.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Sure.
Question about the school funding. How do you allocate that to schools? I know there are a number in the South Coast area that are in fairly polluted areas near and so forth. Is it being allocated by state or by amount of diesel pollution nearby? How do you look at that, the 50 million?
Schools specifically, there was only one line in here, and it was on the monitoring slide. Are you referring to the $60 million, I think it was $60 million pot? It's still to be determined, I would say. We are trying to figure out, and I believe that may have been part of a recent request for information, but we're still trying to figure that out. I mean, this is not one of the $1 billion pots, so it's a much smaller one to work with. That said, in parallel, we also have funding under the bipartisan infrastructure law, where we've been providing $1 billion a year and for 5 years for the replacement of school buses to cleaner technologies. Half of it goes to zero emission technologies, and half we're just defining as cleaner, which can include zero emission as well. So that is its own program, which I didn't really cover here, but a very significant one in its own regard, at the $5 billion of funding over the 5 years. And then that one, last year, the first $1 billion went out for rebates. Definitely, there was a prioritization for those schools with the greatest needs to get access to that funding. We have 4 more years of that coming up. So that is a very significant resource for schools. This one hopefully will do good work as well, but it's 60 million versus the 5 billion. So it's going to be a different magnitude.
I was wondering about for retrofitting with filters and maybe even moving the schools to new construction, different areas away from pollution.
Yeah, I mean, it's early days to know exactly what will be covered there. I think we're still trying to gather input to figure out how to make that $60 million as effective as possible.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
James, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, so you want to go ahead and close it out?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for coming today, and for Ben McCall, our speaker from US EPA. A lot of great opportunities, and it looks like a lot of work to be done to figure out how best to get that money into the right places. So we'll be interested in seeing the updates as they're quickly changing, you said, and posting the information and keeping our members informed. I do want to also thank Bhaskar and Dee for setting up the webinar today, the technology, and Bernadette for moderating. Please do tune into our rescheduled How to Master South Coast AQMD rule development process, which is on April 5th around the same time. And if you have any questions, any follow-up, you can send that to Bhaskar or myself, and also you can email anyone else on the board of the Air and Waste Management Association. Do also check out the chapter pages on the website. Those events will be posted there, and I can keep you informed as well. So with that, I want to thank everyone for attending, our speaker, and hope you have a wonderful and sunny day. Take care.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.